My topic is concerned with media pluralism and diversity, but particularly the issue of monitoring to see what current levels are, and also then to try and ensure that we have and that we maintain an acceptable level of pluralism and diversity in terms of both ownership and content in the media that is essential for the workings of a democratic society. Now, the issue of monitoring has been much debated at European level and internationally for well over a decade, and quite a number of initiatives and pilot schemes have been introduced with varying effects, it has to be said, because of the challenges and the whole complexity of the exercise. But this European and international context is the wider context in which developments in Ireland need to be considered. And as we shall see, most but not all of the initiatives and pilot schemes that have been developed focus on news and current affairs, as they are perceived as key elements necessary to ensure an informed citizenry in a democratic society. So, let's see, oh, sorry, where am I? The first slide that I have here asks two questions, looks at well, one question and makes one comment, but looks at the first of the challenges in devising a monitoring scheme, and that is the onward march of technology. So this slide asks, who is monitoring us? And adverts to the need for us to be watchful of the nature, scope, and potential impact of new technologies as they come on stream. Now, in relation to their capacity to monitor us, you will be aware that social networking sites like Facebook and search engines like Google have immense capacity to monitor content. As survey data confirms, Facebook is becoming increasingly a major source of news for many people, and you may have seen in the last few weeks its capacity to monitor content, even to monitor for media pluralism. You may have seen this study by its own researchers on whether the site's news feed, selected mainly by algorithms, filters out content that users disagree with politically and therefore is bad for democracy and public debate. And that study was able to draw on 10.1 million US Facebook users, the mere 9% of adults who use the site who declare their political affiliation as part of their profile, labeling themselves as liberal or conservative or whatever. And it makes one wonder, how does our capacity to monitor for media pluralism in the much wider field of traditional and new media compare with that? It's also a fact that search engines and online portals are being used directly or indirectly by the public to access journalistic content, while journalists themselves are using them to produce or add to their own journalistic output, just as they are using content which has been produced by users themselves, the so-called citizen journalists, who share them online. So in the context of monitoring then, should these search engines and all these other entities be included? And it has been suggested in a number of European countries that certain tests could be used. A big factor is the opinion-forming power of such entities. And a German study, for example, has suggested that a test could be whether they are journalistically and editorially arranged. But the question remains whether they are or not. Now, monitoring involves watchfulness, and the recent launch of the Apple Watch is prompting discussion about its potential behavior changing or behavior shifting capabilities, giving rise to what I believe is termed glance journalism, glance being defined as a new subatomic particle of news by the Nieman Journalism Lab at Harvard. The last image here is of Amazon's new iCloud-based Echo device, which runs on Amazon Web Services, has voice recognition, voice command, can answer questions. It's like a new type of encyclopedia, take orders for anything from online purchases to news, and Amazon derives its news from a variety of sources, including some local stations. So maybe that's a small example of some measure of pluralism, at least in sourcing. So although we have all of these different devices for receiving news, there is a general feeling that monitoring for media pluralism needs to be substance-based rather than platform-based. But account will still have to be taken of at least some of these new devices as they arise and as they gain currency, if they do, because not all of them will do, of course. And even if they do, we have to be aware that the technology on which they are based will probably be surpassed within 5 years. So how then can we monitor them? Now, faced with such fast-paced developments in this ever-widening media landscape, how do we monitor them? How do we go about it? And the first thing that has to be said is there's no point in monitoring or trying to monitor a situation and declaring it good or bad if there's nothing we can do about it. So it has to be monitoring with a purpose. And it also means that an array of tools is needed, examples of which I've listed here, and that these different tools need to work together, not in isolation. They need to work primarily at national level, but national authorities need to be open to and aware of best practice elsewhere and willing to share and contribute their experience. Now, good quality data, and we've already seen examples of that, it's also essential as an evidence base in any monitoring. And so the question of how best to obtain the best data has also been an issue at European level and internationally. Now, input from the sector and from the media themselves is crucial, in my view at least, because they are in possession of so much information and understanding that public authorities, public regulators would find it hard to match. And it always reminds me of the early days of computer games, when children were the real experts and regulators in some countries had to call in children to help them because their staff couldn't reach the highest levels in the games to even know what the content was to decide if it should be regulated or not. So, although concern with media pluralism began in Europe and internationally long before 2007, it escalated with the arrival of digital. So this slide looks at the period from 2007 to 2011. It indicates some of the initiatives from various bodies, including, as you see there, the Council of Europe, the European Commission, UNESCO, and so on. These and other bodies, there are many more who have contributed, as well as academic writing, publications of organizations like the European Audiovisual Observatory, have contributed very significantly, whether on the level of theory or principles, goals, or methodologies, to the debate on how to achieve and monitor media pluralism. They have much in common in terms of goals and all recognize media pluralism as an essential element of the right to information and freedom of expression. Now, I'm not going to go through those at the moment. I have a background paper which can be made available if anybody's interested in the detail of them. But they've all contributed in different ways to the ongoing debate. And since, just go on to the next one. Since then, the main initiatives have focused particularly on informing, testing, and fine-tuning the various elements contributing to the development of a working or a workable model of monitoring. Some of these have contributed data, rubrics, metrics, methodologies, and pilot studies. Just to take one of them there, Mediadem, there in the middle, it was an EU-funded research project which examined the different forms of media regulation then in place in 14 countries with a view to identifying common patterns, best practices, and emerging problems. And it was during this period also that media pluralism as a democratic goal moved in Europe from a desirable policy pursuit to a positive obligation on states, following from the jurisprudence of the European Court of Human Rights over a number of years, and more recently, the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. The debates on the effects of the inclusion of media pluralism in the Charter and the question of EU competencies in this regard led eventually to the recognition of the central and primary role to be played by member states at national level in what are quite different media landscapes, and the supportive role to be played by the European Commission. And the model that has been pursued at European level is the European Media Pluralism Monitor, or MPM as it's known. It's one to enable risk management. In other words, to provide a mechanism to identify the problem or risk areas so that they can be further monitored or dealt with by national authorities before they crystallize into something bigger. So you can see there's an awful lot of work has gone into the development of the monitor and various stages that were involved and input from so many different organizations. The monitor itself that was devised or was developed with EU funding is not prescriptive as to what's to happen when risk areas are flagged. And in that sense, it merely provides information and an analytical and evidential basis for member states on which to act as they see fit. So to that extent, or to the extent that it is based on theoretically informed and empirically driven research, it can provide a valuable alarm system and benchmark. But as it was first developed, it was very, very complex, very complicated. It was based around 6 domains and 166 indicators. And so it is currently being simplified, redesigned, updated, operationalized, and tested by a research center at the European University Institute in Florence. Now, we turn then to national initiatives, because very often the European and the international reports and studies and so on draw very much from, from the experiences. Thank you. The experience of at national level, and again, I'm not going to go through those, but they have been very significant in, dealing with the problem and suggesting some solutions. And I think if they were all put together, we might have something that would be workable. I see the ministers here, so I'm not going to dwell on the developments in Ireland. It's safe to say that we had the Shreenan report in 2008, which made a number of recommendations, and of course the passing of the Competition and Consumer Protection Act 2014, and Part 4 of it deals with media mergers. Now, I've highlighted there two things. One of particular interest in the realm of monitoring, and that is that the public interest in protecting plurality of the media in the state is central to the whole scheme, to the provisions in the Act, the relevant criteria, and the guidelines, which I'm sure the Minister will talk about. And I think that's really important, and I think that's one of the real strengths of the scheme. And what's in the Act, I think, is good, but I have a question at the end, which, of course, the Act can't resolve, in that it's dealing with media mergers. But how are we to protect media pluralism and diversity outside of merger situations, where there is organic growth, when somebody enters the market, somebody leaves the market, or other things happen in the market? Now, one of the things I can say about most of the reports and studies and so on at European international level is that there's a lot of agreement about general principles and a lot of emerging wisdom. So the importance of accountability, transparency, access, all of these things have been highlighted as being of importance. Access, for instance, there must be ease of access, there must be an extent of access to the market for both entrants and users, so as to maintain or to ensure that there is plurality in the market. They're crucial matters, and they must form part of any monitoring. The UK has produced a number of reports and studies, and Ofcom, for instance, said that high overall reach and consumption and sufficiently low barriers to entry and competition to spur innovation are important in monitoring. Conclusions on monitoring: there are some limitations. We might have very good, useful baseline information, including comparative data, which pinpoint potential risk areas, but what next? What do we do next? And also the measures that can be taken ex post facto when a deficit or problem area is flagged are rather limited. So we need a range of tools, a point that I made earlier. Process is every bit as important as the particular components of it, positive action. I'd like to end on a positive note. As well as regulating, and regulation is sometimes seen as only negative, there are a number of positive actions that can be taken. And I just very briefly quote the Council of Europe on this. It says, "We understand the term monitoring to mean building awareness about the state of the media system and observing the changes to that state over time. Indicators for tackling media concentration include the existence of positive measures by the state to promote pluralist media, both in regulation and in its implementation." And I offer the observation at the end there that an informed and engaged citizenry is what participatory democracy is all about. Thank you.